When you're using web workers in your JavaScript, the first thing you need to do is to detect if the browser supports the web workers interface. It's a good idea to detect features rather than detecting browsers. In other words, rather than having a table that says it's supported in this browser, it's not supported in that browser, and then detecting the browser, it's always a better idea to detect the feature, especially today, now that most of the major browsers are on such rapid release schedules. It would be really hard to keep up to date with all of those changes. So let's take a look at how you do this. So what we have here is a working copy of start.html out of the chapter 2 folder in our exercise files. And this is a copy that's actually up on my web server rather than a copy off of my desktop. And that's because when we run this, we're going to be running it off of the server. You can see here in Chrome, I have this loaded up on my server. Now you're going to need to use your server. You're not going to want to use my server because that won't work. So you're going to have a web server and have these exercise files loaded up on the web server and then make a working copy of the start.html file. And I've named this copy detectworkers-working.html. You can call it what you like, but you want to make sure you're working with a working copy of the start.html file. So let's just take a brief look at this file. You can see we have the HTML up here at the top. We have the JavaScript there, and then just this simple HTML down here. And this is what it looks like in the browser at this time before we do anything else. Let's get started. First thing I'm going to do is I'm going to come up here above the init section, and I'm going to create a function called getWorkerObject. I'm going to put in a little comment above that says, check if window.worker. Now we'll go ahead and code the function. We're going to use a try block, and it's going to have window.worker. So that checks to see if the window.worker object exists, and if it does, we'll return a copy of that object. It's actually a reference to the object. Else, return undefined. And if we have to catch something, I like to format it like this. If we have to catch something, we're just going to return undefined rather than reporting the error. Because we know that that ultimately just means that we can't use this particular interface on this browser, and that's all we need to know at this point. Once we have getWorkerObject coded, come down in here into the init function, and I'm going to create a local variable called oWorker for the worker object, and just give that a null value for now. And if we're not able to get a worker object, so we're going to code that like this. And we'll just go ahead and use that. And we're going to have space for an else. And we'll just display a message that says web workers is not supported. And I'm going to make a copy of that and just change the message down here for otherwise. This browser supports web workers. And the reason I'm testing for the negative rather than the positive is because that's really the test that we're going to use in the long run. Init function is going to go on and do other things if we do support the web workers. So actually this negative test is going to make more sense in the future than it does right now. But for now, we're testing whether or not the web workers works. And I'm going to go ahead and save. I can just press Command S, or I can select save on my editor here. And that actually saves it on the server. This is an editor that supports editing a file on the server through SFTP. I really recommend you use an editor that does that. Text Wrangler or BBEdit on the Mac. Notepad++ has that feature on the PC side. So now that that is all coded up, switch over to our browser and reload this page. It says this browser supports web workers. Now, if I, for example, were to misspell this web worker right here, and just put an X in there instead, I'm pressing Command S to save it, and switch back over to the browser. It says web workers is not supported on this browser. So we'll go ahead and undo that and save. And that's our test for whether or not web workers is supported on this particular browser. So all that's involved in doing this test is I have this try catch block, which is JavaScript's version of exception handling. And I test whether or not this window.worker object exists. If it does, I return the object. And if it doesn't, I return the undefined value. And then here in my init function, which you know is called down here on window.onload equals init. That calls the init function as soon as the window is all loaded, all the HTML is loaded up in the window. It calls this getWorker object, and it copies the reference to that object into this oWorker variable, and we'll use that later in our web application. So you can see it's fairly simple to detect support for workers in our web application.